Okay. Hello. This is Lo-Fi Mark using my webcam, going live, and yeah, I'm struggling with basically live streaming, but that's the whole point of doing it, I suppose. And today I'm going to read chapter 2 of my book, which is called The Swamp. And yeah, I'm going to read the whole thing. Hopefully, it's going to be self-explanatory. Hopefully, I don't get too much of a frog in my throat. I've got a nice big cup of coffee. But we'll start. Chapter Swamp. The Swamp. Any project that has the potential to be of value has an element of the unknown about it. It's like trying to build on a swamp. It's a complex space with complex geology, history, and ownership. The only way to progress is to acknowledge its complexity and explore. It's a quote from Henry David Thoreau. In the wilderness is the preservation of the world. Imagine that a property developer has given you money to develop houses in a swamp. How would you go about doing that? Would you just start work, or would you feel the need to do a little bit of exploration first? Wouldn't it be a good idea to know what's in the swamp? What if I told you that there were people who already live in the swamp, and that there's no way that you're going to be able to build without upsetting them? They don't want you to build here. They're quite happy with things just the way they are. But then again, there are also people who are keen to move into the swamp when you have built something. They've already given the property developer money. They want you to build in the swamp fast so they can move in. People who live here and people who want to live there, people who live there and people who want to live there, they both have interests in the swamp. But they aren't the only ones. There are people who care generally about bogs and marshes. There are people who are interested in building regulations for any kind of engineering or construction. There is government, local government will probably want to levy some kind of tax. You will probably need planning permission. National government will have building regulations. There are people who you need to talk to about getting a road to come right up to the swamp, because whatever you're doing in the swamp, the likelihood is that you'll need to connect to existing infrastructure. And beyond government, there might even be global bodies that care about this swamp. There are people who don't care about you, don't care about the property developers. All they care about is the swamp. These people might be eco-activists. They might be political activists. The swamp might be on a very old burial ground. It might be the site of a buried temple. And that's just the people who are interested in the swamp. What about the plants and animals who already live in the swamp? Maybe there are new species there interesting to science. Maybe there are plants unknown to Western medicine, but the locals use them as a miracle cure. What about the geology? Maybe there's oil. Maybe there's gold. Why am I babbling about swamps? What does this have to do with software product development? What's the point I'm trying to make? My point is that there are a lot of people who have very varied interests in what you're doing. Some of those are directly associated with the project. Some of those will directly benefit from it. But there are also a lot of other people who are only distantly associated with your project. When you start, you might not have heard of them. They might not have heard of you. But you're still important to each other. If the product is going to be a success, it would be good to keep those people happy. Maybe there is something that you can do for those people that would make them happy, that would change their world for the better, or make the organization that you're working for a fortune, or both. On the other hand, it might be a bad idea to annoy them. Maybe you can't avoid it, but it would still be good to know that it's going to happen. Here we're picking up on the way of seeing projects that we talked about in chapter Streams. Projects are things that are done in a complex environment. There are lots of people who are interested in that environment, and the interests that they have are extremely varied. I really didn't understand this until I worked on one project. On this project, I worked with a woman who did research with users. I'd worked on other projects that had user researchers, but they hadn't done research like she did it. She really did research with users. And as soon as the project started, she contacted potential users of the product and arranged meetings. She was running workshops with them, getting to know them and developing a relationship. First, she got to understand their pain points. Then she got them to start to sketch with pen and paper graphical user interfaces that might start to address these points. Then the designer on the team designed interfaces informed by this research. They look real, but at this stage, they were still only models. These were again tested with users. If there were serious problems with them, they were modified and then tested again. This kept going. She hired another researcher. They both did research on users. They did research with internal users in the organization we were working for and external users who were the organization's customers. I worked on this project for over 3 years, and the research never stopped. It didn't stop when we had working software that we could test with users. It didn't stop when we had a version of the software that had a copy of the user's sensitive data running on it. This gave them a chance to see what it would be like using the live product. It certainly didn't stop when we went live. As I said, I'd been involved in projects that had user researchers before, but this was the first time that I'd seen a project that was led by user research right from the start, and the project continued to be informed by user research all the way through development. I learned a lot from watching this happen, and there were a couple of things that were surprising about it for me. The first is that if you do this much research on your users, you won't just find out about your users. You'll get to know about a lot of other people who aren't exactly users. But to return to our metaphor, these are people who are interested in the swamp. We found other regulatory groups that our users needed to please. Hello? Hello? Hello, somebody's there. I'm going to carry on reading if that's okay. You've missed about a page. Where was it? As I said, I've been involved in projects that had user research before, but this was the first time I'd seen a project that was led by user research right from the start, and the project continued to be informed by user research all the way through development. I learned a lot from watching this happen, and there were a couple of things that were surprising about it for me. The first is that if you do this much user research on users, you won't just find out about your users. You'll get to know a lot about other people who aren't exactly users. But to return to our metaphor, these are still people who are interested in the swamp. We found other regulatory groups that our users needed to please, and our product had to support. These were people who, even if they weren't users, were stakeholders, and they went on our stakeholder map. This was another important idea that I hadn't come across before. Do enough research on your users and you end up with a stakeholder map. Do even more research on your users and you get a stakeholder ecology. You start to understand not only who all the people are that you have, you start to understand not only who all the people are who have some interest in the swamp, but also how these stakeholders interact. You start to see what's really happening in and around the swamp. You start to see opportunities to do good and be a success. Many of these would be not at all obvious if it weren't for these investigations. And you also start to see where there are dangers and problems and potentially unhappy people or tricky regulations that could cause you and the project trouble. This project was the first time that I had really understood the value of user research, but I really should have understood it about 15 years earlier because I had previously worked on a user-centered design project as a researcher. Maybe the thing that was that it wasn't exactly a software development setting. Maybe I'm just a bit slow, but I hadn't quite connected the dots. What can a 10-year-old teach me? I was sitting in an office in Athens, arguing with a Polish software developer in a room full of technical guys from all over Europe. None of them seemed to think that we needed to do any user research on a project that had the phrase user-centered design in its title. It was a European-funded project. The first aim of the project was to design an application that used tangible user interfaces. Tangible user interfaces are interfaces that you can get hold of, pick up, and move around. The second aim of the project was to use these interfaces to help school children construct discursive arguments. My organization was doing the user research for the project. As I said, iterative user-centered design was in the title of the funding bid. Still, most of the software developers and search engine experts on the team were skeptical. They didn't see the point of talking to users, especially since in this case, our users were school children. But still, we did it. And what we found was interesting, and as I realize now, is almost always the case when you do user research, unexpected. It pointed out a potential route towards making a successful product. And this was a route that, if we hadn't talked to users, we would have never imagined. One thing that we found straight away from talking to users, these were school children who were 10 to 11 years old, was that they didn't really need help with the logic of an argument. For example, when discussing the subject of graffiti, they understood that there was a contradiction between statements like people should be able to express themselves freely and it's against the law to paint messages on public buildings. What the kids did seem to need help with was putting the bits of evidence that they found into a structure that worked as a persuasive argument. That was the great thing about doing research in real schools. But when we started to do that research, we found out about some other concerned parties who didn't live in the swamp. In this case, a school, a very nice school, I should say, in Leamington Spa. They were a long way from Leamington Spa. Even so, they really cared about what happened there. Who were they? They were the government. At the time when we did this research, the government insisted that all the schools in England follow a national curriculum. This meant that pretty much every lesson that the kids did had to show that it satisfied a specific learning requirement. We realized this after these early research sessions. We needed to design our future research sessions so that at the same time as giving us what we needed for research, they directly addressed something mentioned in the curriculum. And we needed to make it obvious to the teachers that this was what we were doing. Why? Because the teachers were also swamp residents, of course. If we did this, we made it much easier for the teachers to support us. Otherwise, the number of lessons that we'd be able to have with the children would have been severely limited. Fortunately, we had an ex-teacher on our team, so we could design our research sessions so that they also made sense as national curriculum-focused lessons. A long time later, I find myself working on a software development project. This company was a successful and highly regarded one in one area of business, mobile phone service provision. In the world of mobile phone service provision, it had a pretty cool image. So some of the senior people there wondered if they could succeed in another area, personal loans. Yes, that was the project, making personal loans cool. Again, this team had done a lot of work to develop a personal loan website, and they'd done a lot of research with users. Then a potential business partner mentioned a possible problem. They pointed out that any company that lends money needs to be regulated by financial authorities. You may lift your eyebrows slightly at a company that didn't talk to the regulators before starting up in the money lending business. But I would claim that a substantial part of the reason that this got missed was that they hadn't done enough research. This time, maybe not strictly user research, but they hadn't sufficiently explored the swamp. My bet is that the research with users and mapping of stakeholders would have made something as important as, if you want to be a money lender, you'll have to fill in a big application form, very clear, very quickly. This project would also have seriously benefited from user research. It later turned out, another big surprise, that most of the people who wanted to borrow money are the people to whom it's either expensive or impossible to lend money because they're bad at credit risks. But the point I'm making here is that it isn't enough to do research with users. You also have to find all these other people, regulators, investors, commentators on the ethics of your industry. The interest rates. I'm missing a page. Page 4. Hang on a minute. I'm going to have to read page 4 electronically because I'm missing it. Right. It's a lark, this live casting, isn't it? Right, okay. Where are we? Let me find this. I've lost page 4 from the printout. So I'm going to read page 4 from my screen. Note to self, next time check you've got all the pages before you start reading. Okay. Page 4. Okay, so what was I saying? The point I'm making here is that it isn't enough to do user research, but to do research with users. You also have to find all these other people, regulators, investors, commentators on the ethics of the industry. The interest rates needed to make lending to people who are poor credit risks brings with it a set of commentators and critics. To come back to the swamp metaphor, these are people who don't live in the swamp. These are people who live miles from the swamp and will never visit it, but they still care about what goes on in there. And if these people aren't happy, sometimes they can kill a project stone dead. You might say that I'm exaggerating. Software development projects aren't that different from one another. Swamps aren't all that different from one another. You've seen one swamp, you've seen them all. Do you know what that sounds like to me? It sounds like ignoring the pirate ship, which is what we'll talk about in chapter ship, which is basically ignoring an obvious problem. But also later in chapter car, where we talk about empirical process, we're going to talk about driving a car as a metaphor for managing a project. And here's just an early view of that way of seeing things. Some people might say one project is pretty much like any other. I don't see why you need to do any more investigation with users. And essentially they're saying something like that's the equivalent of, yeah, I've driven cars before. There's no need for me to look at the road. You control a car and managing the team might be similar from project to project, but outside of the car or the team, the environment can be very different. And my main point in using this metaphor of the swamp is that if you look out through the windscreen, you may well find that there isn't a road, or that the road is blocked by monsters, or that there's a very nice road and it looks easy to drive down. But if you do, you will get a massive fine, or actually in some cases get sent to jail. Lots of people will say that user research is a waste of time. Actually, more often than not, they won't say that. They will agree with you. Yes, user research is very important, but it just isn't needed on this project. Or they won't bother making any argument. They just won't put any budget for it in their projects. They won't hire people to do it. Lots of people will see a software development project as merely that, a matter of software development. Do you know what you should do if you're managing a team in this kind of situation? You should do user research anyway. If you don't have somebody on the team who's a dedicated user researcher, you should still do some user research. You should do user research with the people in the team that you have, on the basis that they're sentient humans and their responses to user interfaces will be interesting and useful. And you should still push to talk to users, or where possible, include a user as a product owner or a business analyst. Okay, it won't be anywhere near as good as doing a full program of user research by professionals, but one of the main aims of doing this research should be to find out surprising stuff. Then maybe you can take what you find back to whoever is paying for the project. Maybe you can show them what you found and use that as a case for more user researchers and more stakeholder research. Another criticism of my insistence on user research is what might be called the faster horse objection. Henry Ford said something like, if I'd given people what they want, I'd have given them a faster horse. When I talk about the swamp, I'm not saying that you should give any of those people associated with it exactly what they want. What I am saying is that whatever you do has a much greater chance of success if it's been informed by what they want, hate, fear, hope for, wish for. I've worked on lots of projects where we either haven't done any user research or we haven't done anywhere near enough. And if I'm being totally honest, on most of those projects, it didn't bother me that much at the time. It's easy to get wrapped up in the problem and the way it's presented and not go looking for trouble by exploring the swamp. But all of those projects found trouble anyway, or found an audience for what got built or failed to find an audience for what got built because of a lack of understanding of environment in which they were working. And that's exactly why you should be getting user researchers involved in projects right at the beginning. I described a project earlier, the one where we did research with children in the classroom. That project was described as an iterative user-centered design, and that is pretty much what we did. I should have learned from that project how important user research is, but I still didn't really put it together. I still didn't really quite realize how important for the success of a project it is that you do iterative design and development, and that it should be user-centered. The only way to do that is to keep talking to users and keep putting, right, I think, oh, this is going well, isn't it? Hang on a second. And keep putting working software in their hands. Now that I've seen it really work, I'll switch back now to the live screen. Now that I've seen it really work, I'm convinced that it's one of the best ways of reducing risk on a project. But it's still going to be hard to persuade the people who are paying for that project that they need user researchers, and not just one, and not just at the beginning. They need people talking to users and potential users all the way through. There's something I feel I should earn up to here. I'm convinced that the value of continuing user research through software and interesting paragraph. There's something I feel I should earn up to here. I'm convinced of the value of continuing user research through a software product development project. But I don't know yet how to combine user research and the early development of working software without creating disagreements and arguments. Research on users and stakeholders needs to keep going all the way through a project, and what the researchers find out needs to inform software development. Then that software needs to be put in the hands of users. This is what we'll talk about more in the next chapter, Chapter Escape. Then the team needs to listen to the feedback that comes from users. This feedback needs to be considered and incorporated into future versions of the software. Making sure that the team is well informed is important. The best chance of success for a project is when the team are aware of what the users and stakeholders want. The chances get even better if the team can put working software into users' hands, and even better still if feedback from users starts to guide future iterations. But it isn't an easy ride. When the interests of all or some of the interested parties in the swamp are discovered, it's very unlikely that they'll all be compatible. And if they aren't, there are often going to be a lot of different possible solutions that fully or partially satisfy one or other of the group's needs. In agile methods, the final decision about what goes in the product is supposed to rest with the product owner. The idea is that they listen to the feedback that comes in from all directions and make good decisions about which bits to listen to and which bits to ignore. But of course, the product owner is just another human being, and very likely that the decisions that they make won't be perfect. In a way, it's your job as a project manager to make sure that these conflicts happen. But at the same time, you have another important job as a project manager. You need to look after the psychological safety of the team. Reassure your team that the conflicts that are emerging as a result of doing research are good, healthy conflicts. You may not get things right initially, but if you're setting up an iterative process, you don't have to. At every stage, even if you get something wrong, further user research will pick it up and allow you to correct it. What if your project has no budget at all for user research? What if it has all the resources it needs to do good research? There is still something else that it's good to do as an additional way of exploring the swamp. Talk to your stakeholders about risks. Talking to senior stakeholders is, in my experience, an extremely good way of finding out about what is going on in the organization. I'd worked for many projects that had a risk register. My experience was that this was a document that got written at the very beginning of a project and then ignored. As a result, my opinion of risk registers was that they weren't very useful. Then, at the beginning of a project, the product owner informed me that the organization mandated that we have a risk register. I told him that I didn't think that they were a good idea, But he gently insisted, the power of gentle insistence, and he came back with a suggestion that he had found on the internet for an agile risk register. This was a Kanban style board with 3 columns. At the beginning of the project, a group of us got together, me, the delivery manager, the product owner's boss, and a few additional senior stakeholders. In a one-off workshop, we came up with a list of risks. We added them to the Kanban board and scored them. The idea of the score was that it was a combination of the cost to the project of fixing the fallout of the risk if it actually became an eventuality. We expressed that in days of work for the team. For example, a full security breach might take the whole team a month to fix. So we will give that risk a cost of 20. Then we gave each risk a probability as a percentage. As a group, we thought that there was a small but not insignificant chance of this happening. So we gave that a probability score of 5%. Then the overall score for the risk was 120 times 5. Once we'd done this for all the risks that we'd identified, we ended up with a 3-column board. One column had high risks, greater than 1,000 points. One had medium risks, greater than 500 at less than 1,000. And another had small risks, less than 500. And we also had a total, the sum scores on all the tickets. Every 2 weeks, this same group of people took another look at the risk board. We talked through the risks from highest to lowest and changed the scores. And we added any new risks that anyone in the group identified. In one sense, none of this discussion was about the scores on the risk. In one sense, none of this discussion about scores on the risks mattered. But in another sense, it was a lifesaver for the project. Because what became obvious was that when we talked about the risks and changes to the risk scores, pertinent news about what was going on in the broader organization got discussed. Stuff that otherwise we might not have been officially told. But often, this was information that was really pertinent to the project. Often these were things to do with budgets and deadlines. Sometimes they were to do with strange to us text changes that we were being asked to make, which it turned out were being made to pacify distant but influential pressure groups. Do a show and tell of working software. Scrum is the most popular agile framework, and show and tell is one of its names for a meeting where the team demonstrate working software to stakeholders. If you're doing user research, it's also an opportunity to talk about the findings that you got from user research. Invite people to the meeting as broadly as you can across the organization, and even out into public if that's possible. Demonstrate to yourselves and anyone else who will watch and listen. Talk through the findings of your user research. Walk through the designs that have been created as a result of that user research. Demonstrate the working software that your team has been working on over the typically last 2 weeks. The development team are often reluctant to do this, especially if what they're working on doesn't have an obvious UI. It's still important that they do it. Just one comment might let you know that something that's vital for your project. Yes, it could derail your project, but when would you rather know? Sooner or later. Embrace your deadlines. Yes, I said it. Embrace deadlines as opportunities to negotiate scope and set software free, but also you'll find out that more about the swamp. Some bosses see deadlines as opportunities to mess with you. They want to make you and your team work longer hours while giving them time off from thinking about what a product really needs to do. Some bosses just see the promise of delivering for a deadline as a way of getting their boss off their back. But you don't have to see them like that. You can see them as a powerful, if a little clumsy, way of exploring the stakeholder map. The map of the swamp. If you do try to release something, who jumps out and tells you that you can't? Who suddenly appears and tries to take credit? Who objects to doing anything on the grounds of security, accessibility, secrecy, or organizational embarrassment? Which non-functional requirement really is a deal breaker that stops the software from going live. Software wants to be free. You should want it to be free. You should do your best to help it out. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter, Chapter Escape. Exploit the crisis. What if your team does release software that nobody wants to use? What if your team does release software that nobody is allowed to use because it doesn't meet regulations? One way to think of this is that all successful software becomes iterative and incremental sooner or later. All successful software incorporates feedback from its users sooner or later. This is the point of comparing a software development project to development in a swamp. A software development project is, to some degree, built on uncharted ground, even though the people who fund it will rarely talk about it in such terms. It's not clear what's hidden in the waters of the swamp. It might be untold riches, it might be a virulent disease, but whatever is found there, lots of people are going to have an opinion about it. The people who already live there, the people who want to live there, they have opinions. They have things that they value. The same with the people who will never live there, but still have opinions and interests. This is because they are in power, or because they want to preserve some aspect of the environment, or possibly for some other reasons that without research, it would be difficult to really understand. The message of this chapter is that the place that's pointed to by the dream of a project that we talked about in chapter streams is a mysterious and complex place. And the way to give your project the best chance of thriving in that mysterious and complex place is research, investigation, and frequent releases of working software. Talk to as many of the interested and potentially interested parties as you can. Understand their interests and how their interests and values interact or conflict. Find out as much as you can about the lie of the land. And one way to do this most effectively is to bring into the team professional surveyors, user researchers who can talk to the interested parties. But having conversations with interested parties isn't just the responsibility of user researchers. It's also your responsibility as project manager. One way of thinking about project management is as a facilitation of conversations. One way of thinking about the chances of success in a project is by increasing the quality of the conversations that you have with the people who have interests and stakes in the project. The people who own, live, and care about the swamp. Mostly in this chapter, we've talked about the importance of exploring the swamp using user research and stakeholder research. We've also briefly mentioned a complementary way of exploring the swamp, and that's to build something in the swamp. To let interested parties see, touch, even feel what it's like to use this new thing. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next chapter, Chapter Escape. Poof. Okay. So that's the end of this live stream. Welcome all your comments and suggestions. Apologies for missing page 4. I don't know what happened there. It might be on the floor in the study next door. So yes, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.